Welcome to the screencast for Chapter 13, Biodiversity. First, let's look at the objectives. Students will be able to define biodiversity and explain how it exists on three levels: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. Second, students will understand that biodiversity has been declining significantly. Biodiversity is declining within wildlife, and biodiversity of our crops and livestock are also declining. Third, students will be able to identify and explain the causes of declining biodiversity. You'll be using the acronym HIPCO to help remember what these causes are. Fourth, we will look at approaches to conserving biodiversity. The two main approaches are the single species approach, where we try to protect a single organism or group of organisms, such as marine mammals, for example, which would include seals. An ecosystem approach would be the second approach to conserving biodiversity, and that would be looking at protecting an entire ecosystem and all of the different species that exist in that ecosystem. So your textbook begins with a case study of a marine sanctuary, and you can read through the book in more detail to learn about the sanctuary. But a couple of key points I think that it makes are that when we look at conserving biodiversity, it's not just land organisms that we might typically think about, but also includes marine biodiversity, a very important part of our biodiversity. A second key point that's made in the case study is that it's not a political-sided issue. It's been an important ethic of many people in the United States, many presidents in the United States, Republican and Democrat, over the last 100 or so years. And so that's a nice point to read about. Now, on the flip side, we have the problem here, and that is that we are in the midst of a sixth great extinction. So we will look at that in more detail in just a minute. You may recall from an earlier chapter that we looked at the process of evolution and how that shapes and increases biodiversity. Now, at this point, we're going to look at that again, but also look at the opposite process, extinction. Extinction happens naturally. All the time there are species that go extinct, but sometimes in Earth's geological history, which is very long, extinctions have occurred at a greater rate than the normal background rate of extinction. So we need to start the chapter on biodiversity by looking further at extinction. First, let's define extinction. Extinction is when there are no longer any individuals of a particular species on Earth. We're currently losing approximately 50,000 species per year, and that's out of about 2 million known identified species, though it is approximated that there are probably up to 10 million species, but really 50,000 out of our known 2 million are becoming extinct each year. That is 0.5% of all species now alive will go extinct each year. I'd like you to pause for a minute and think if you can name any species that you know of that have gone extinct. Okay, so now let's see what has happened naturally over the years on Earth. There have been 5 global mass extinctions that have occurred or are known to have occurred. And that's when large numbers of species went extinct over a relatively short period of geological time. Here's a graph from an earlier chapter, Chapter 5. And on the x-axis, you see time in millions of years ago. So 100 million years ago, 200, 300, 400, and 500 million years ago. Significant periods of time. And here you have the number of genera. So you might recall from taxonomy, genus and species being the most specific levels of taxonomic classification. So we're one step above the species level here and to the genera classification. And you can see that there are trends where biodiversity increases. This is based on the number of fossils that have been found primarily. And then in a relatively short geological period of time, you see a significant dip. So this dip here is approximately half from its peak to here in a very, very short period of time. Then there's some more climbing and dipping and another great dip from the peak here to about 1/2 of the number of species here. And again, a very short period of time. Here's another one. It was moving along quite steadily. And then there was another sharp dip. This one is about 3/4 of the species going extinct. A smaller dip here, about half, then increasing numbers of genera. And then here about 65 million years ago, there was another great crash. That is the period of time in which the dinosaurs went extinct. And then the number of species and genera have again increased. So here we are today, and though it doesn't show it on this map, on this graph rather, because it's very hard to show, because it's a very small period of time, but we're having a significant dip here. Now, clearly, since we weren't around, there were not people on the planet when there were dinosaurs, so humans had nothing to do with any of these other mass extinctions, and maybe understanding the reasons for these extinctions would be helpful. Things like meteorites crashing, volcanoes, also causing too much dust in the air, which blocks photosynthesis, and different things like that. However, we know that in recent times, in recent decades, none of that has been happening to a significant degree. So we have to look at other causes of extinction, particularly the impact of human populations. We're going to take a little detour here for a minute and look at the benefits of biodiversity for humans. And the top two pictures go together and the bottom two pictures go together. So in the top two pictures, you see instrumental value and intrinsic value. Some people have a philosophy that biodiversity should be preserved because it's of instrumental or useful value to humans. So in this example, they're showing a picture of aloe, and you know that some of the extract from an aloe plant leaf can be used to treat sunburns and has other values as well. A different philosophy is shown on the right, and that's intrinsic value. And here we see a cute little sea otter, but it could be any species. And intrinsic value means that biodiversity should be protected because all living things have a value in and of themselves and should therefore be protected. Now, looking ahead to what we're going to talk about, how to preserve biodiversity, we have two approaches, and sometimes one is better than the other, or sometimes we only have a choice of using one or the other. So the first example is here on the left, single species approach. And here's a whale and its calf. It might be a right whale, I'm not sure, but the idea is that protecting that specific species will protect it from becoming extinct. A second approach is the ecosystem approach, and that would be the example of the marine sanctuary in the case study. So the whole ecosystem, the whole bay, any particular body of water like a lake or a mountain would be protected. And that has the added value of protecting all species within that ecosystem. Okay, now we're going to look at a case study very close to home, and I think it's a very positive story. And that's a story of Stellwagen Bank Marine Sanctuary. So here's a map of Cape Cod in the dark green, and then we have Cape Cod Bay here in the lighter green, and then we have Stellwagen Bank area right over here. And then we have some deeper areas of the Stellwagen Bank area. So you can see it's raised. It's a plateau, basically, that was also formed the same way Cape Cod and the islands were formed from glacial deposits. And because it's shallow, there's a lot of sun penetration, a lot of light, and there's a lot of biodiversity there. If you go onto the Stellwagen Bank website, you can actually see different things like the seafloor surface there, and it's teeming with life. It almost looks like a coral reef. There are all kinds of organisms living there. And because it's shallow and light can penetrate, there's a lot of phytoplankton, which then leads to many other organisms being able to live there as well. And it's a big, important fishing ground as well for the fishermen for this reason. Now, here's the problem and the solution that happened. So when big boats bringing goods came into Boston Harbor, they took this route here shown with a solid outline. They would come up the coast here and make a left turn right north of Cape Cod and then head in here to Boston Harbor. And the problem was that they were striking whales, in particular the right whales, which were endangered. They have very limited numbers of them. And this wasn't good for anybody. It wasn't good for the ships either. There have been several stories of ships not knowing that they had struck a whale and dragging it all the way into port, having to run their engines full throttle and using up a lot of fuel because they did not know that they were dragging a whale along with them. And obviously, with a limited whale population, there were at that time about 400, maybe a little more, right whales known to be in existence, North Atlantic right whales. So there was a coalition that worked together, and it was made up of scientists from the Stellwagen Bank Marine Sanctuary and the shipping industry and some government officials as well. And the scientists logged the whale sounds, which are each of these little dots. So whales communicate by a song, and each time a song was heard, there was a dot added to the map. And as you can see, with the original shipping lane, they ran through areas that were very densely populated with whales here and here. They decided to move the shipping lane, make it a little longer, and you can see much less densely populated whale population here, and even well lower here. So the shipping industry did have to spend more money because it takes more time to take a longer route and more fuel, but it was a win-win for everyone, and they agreed to this and have established new shipping routes without anyone legislating it. It was simply an agreement that worked for both sides. So I hope you find that to be a really good example of how the environment and the organisms in it, biodiversity, can be protected while still maintaining the economic interests of various businesses, the fishing industry, etc. So I'll tell you more about the right whale in later slides, but for now that's a wrap for this particular screencast.